Hey Dave, how you doing today?
Not bad, Nick. How are you?
It's Friday.
It's
No,
Friday.
no complaints on a Friday. Podcast
No,
time.
I'll work through the next couple hours and free for a couple days.
That's right. So, got another good episode on tap for today. We're going to continue our strategic, reliable blueprint process. Wow, that's a mouthful. We are in stage 6. So be sure, if you have not already, you can go back and listen to all of the other stages that brought us to this point. But right now, today, we're talking about our strategy meeting, the strategy part of the process, which I know, Dave, is one of your favorites, where we actually start getting into the financial planning software and start moving some of the pieces of the puzzle around.
Yes, start to actually solve problems. So we've talked. We've built a vision for the client, figured out where they want to go, mapped that out. We've talked through the obstacles, the things that stand in their way, which is usually a money situation, and how we
Mm-hmm.
can tackle that to get them pointed in the right direction. And then strategy meeting is where we actually start formulating recommendations for the client. And one of the things I really like about the way we do it and the way we present this to clients is this isn't us making recommendations from on high, as the CFPs just dictating what the client should do. This first meeting on strategy is really about give and take with the client and working through the priorities that we've established.
Yeah, so typically coming out of the obstacles meeting, we're obviously considering those obstacles and considering solutions to them. But what we're also doing is starting to build out the plan in terms of, our traditional client is usually approaching retirement. So maybe we're, 2, 3 years out from retirement. So we're looking at, okay, how do we figure out what your retirement income goal is? And then in addition to that, what other goals do you have that came out of the vision, whether that's travel or, helping kids through college or paying for a marriage, a wedding for a daughter, son, things of that nature. And so we have kind of a good idea of the spending goals. And now, kind of what we do as a team behind the scenes is we go through and build out the plan for what do we do from a retirement income standpoint? Where do we take from? What do we do from an investment standpoint? And really start to try to get an idea of what those recommendations will be. And there's ultimately always a couple things that is really best for the client to be brought in on, in terms of seeing how it might work one way versus how it might work a different way, so we can get their buy-in on what that looks like and what they're more
Yeah.
comfortable with.
Yeah. So to put it a different way, the biggest obstacle that we're usually dealing with is that everybody's got just a finite amount of money, right? And then
Mm.
we've got
Yep.
competing goals, and you touched on a couple of them. Pretty typical scenario is, say, a middle-aged couple with a couple, they're within earshot of retirement, but maybe they've still got, some kids at home that we need to balance, saving for retirement with, saving for tuition dollars. And so, there's no mathematically perfect answer because the
Mm.
resources are finite and everything has trade-offs. So,
Hmm.
this meeting is about us saying, okay, well, if you save X for towards college, this is what this would look like, and that leaves Y for retirement. And we can play around with those things and talk to the client about, how they view those different outcomes. And then, and another obvious one is how much risk are you willing to take in the portfolio? So there's another lever we
Right.
can press and show the client, okay, if you take more risk, less risk, this is what it looks like. Um, how do those preferences come together to create a plan?
Yeah, and that's kind of, when we're building portfolios, and part of why we do the financial plan first is we can come to a really good idea of what the portfolio fit is going to be because of some of those trade-offs. And it's always kind of interesting when we do this risk reward analysis where, having no risk or a limited risk is, gives one solution, and having maximum risk gives another solution. But usually, it's kind of in that bell-shaped curve in terms of where the risk should be depending on the
Right.
plan outcome.
Right. Because
So,
if people don't take enough risk, then inflation is an issue over retirement, depending on
right.
what kind of assets they have. And if they take too much risk, well, then too many bad things could go wrong between here and
Right. So it's this kind of this idea of we're backing into the portfolio from not only what the client risk profile is, but also what the goals are, what the time horizon is.
there.
And so just a really helpful way to build a portfolio.
Yeah, we've talked about that concept
Um,
or the trade off between risk capacity, meaning how much risk can the plan absorb, and risk tolerance, which is how much risk can the client absorb. And those
right.
are
Right.
often different things. So, yeah.
And I, to go back to this whole process, the importance of having that vision and having that laid out plan of what that looks like is there's always, trade offs that need to be made and changes that need to be made. And so having that vision of, and really buying into that vision of this is why we're doing this makes the planning part that much easier. And I'd like to touch on the other side of that too. And in a good scenario of when this comes up a lot of times is we will also, as a part of retirement income planning, start taking a look at Social Security options. So just, a quick background on Social Security, normal Social Security, depending on when you were born, is somewhere between 66 and 67, but you can start taking it at 62 or you can wait as long as 70. So there's some choices that can be made there. And, depending on life expectancy and things of that nature, you might want to wait longer versus start earlier. But there's another side of that coin, which is what your spending or your risk preferences in terms of, because usually if
Hmm.
you're waiting for Social Security, we're taking money out of your portfolio to compensate for that. And that brings in a fear factor, risk factor that I think a lot of people forget about.
Right. Right. Yeah, and same kind of discussion around pension options too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so all these things, they, mathematically, a lot of times we know what the software is going to do in terms of, if we know, that we're planning on you living until age 100, then we know what the software is going to say in terms of whether or not you should start early versus start late, whether or not you should take, 100% survivor in your pension versus straight life. But those are all options because they're options, obviously, but they're also we're expecting something to happen when we program that into the system. And
Hmm.
so there's some trade-offs there that we really need to kind of think about. We need the client really to think about in
Right.
terms of what that all looks like. And just coming back to that retirement, the other one is retirement date, right? So if we're sitting down and we're thinking, okay, 2 years for retirement, well, if we come to a point where it looks like we're going to be a little bit short of hitting our goals in terms of our
Hmm.
goal spending, our goal income, then it's kind of that trade-off, right? So one of the things that I love to do is say, okay, what does working one more year do in terms of your ability to hit your goals? Or 2 more years, what does that do in terms of, and I think a lot of people are surprised when we come back with it's only going to add $100 a month to your income level by waiting a year.
And to take that another level, there've been a few clients I've worked with over the years who, we might have said, 2022 is their target retirement, and they'll call me up and they'll say, you know what, I think it's actually going to be May of 2022, where I was originally
Yeah.
thinking December. So do we need to change anything or do anything? And I just kind of chuckle because I know, nothing can be that precise, right? Unless there's some
Right.
magical like cliff thing that happens, like vesting of something, then usually 6 months increments are just not enough to deal with. Anyway, didn't mean to take
Yeah,
us down
no,
that.
absolutely. But and I think you're right too. And the other side of that too, a lot of times what's interesting for me in doing this for a lot of folks is once we give them a lot of people like the go ahead, if you will, in terms of we got the plan and we're thinking retiring in 2023, oftentimes people feel a lot better about that, and sometimes even work longer because there's not that stress and strain knowing that you can walk away at any point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the Johnny Paycheck factor.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's always been an interesting dynamic to me. As soon as I tell a client that, you could retire this year if you wanted to, and this is what it would look like, and they're like, wow, I could
Yeah.
do that.
It's definitely not as
And
stressful to go back to work. Right.
yeah. Yeah. So I always find that as an interesting dynamic. So back to the plan and the process. So we kind of work on these strategies as a group. We'll present them to the clients and get their buy-in and show them a couple different things if they want to look at different retirement years and that. And then the next thing that we do is we kind of stress test it, and try to blow it up to a lot of degrees in terms
Mm-hmm.
of what could go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So a common one that people are worried about is cuts to Social Security. Is Social Security going to be there? Um, and that obviously is a factor that's being thrown around when you listen to the news, in terms of, every once in a while you'll see it pop up as a big news story, even though, it's been going on for a while, that the Social Security trust fund is going to run out.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, it's that's not a scenario that keeps me up at night of the many things that do, but it is definitely a discussion we have quite often. And I just always point out they call it the third rail of American politics for a reason. And
Right.
we tend to govern by crisis. So the more it becomes a crisis, the more likely it is for Congress to actually do something to shore it up. And there are real solutions that could shore it up without affecting retirees' incomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, obviously one of the common things that we'll do is, do a 10-15% cut in Social Security, just to show people that, yes, this
Yeah.
is a part of your overall plan, but your plan works even if there are some cuts to it. So there is Social Security cuts. There's also a simulation that will run oftentimes, like a bear market test, in terms of look at your portfolio, look at what might potentially happen, or if your returns aren't as good as we're projecting them to be, what does that look like? Oftentimes we will also do an inflation one, although inflation hasn't really been a concern for a long time for most people, but it's starting to pick up now. So that's one that's coming back around into some of the different things that we do. But the other thing that we'll do is we'll start to look at some of the insurance scenarios as well.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So not Go ahead,
I
Dan.
think it's worth pointing out though too. A lot of times when we do those stress tests, we do find that spending as written in the plan may not work if some of those scenarios come to fruition. So, meaning returns are significantly worse, or Social Security would get cut, or pensions would get cut. It would affect spending. But one thing we can do is a kind of quantify that, and B,
Mm-hmm.
and when you can quantify it, like in our software, we split goals up into things you absolutely need versus things you want, and things that are kind of, we call them wishes in the plan, things that you would do
Mm-hmm.
if everything came true. And so our goal in those kind of scenarios is to make sure that all the needs are covered and as many of the wants are covered. I guess if you really need it covered, then it's not a want, it's a need, right? So
Yeah.
the other thing it can do is lead to looking at strategies to create safer income, which is a whole different topic. But don't just assume because we stress tested it that everything's great. A lot of times we do have to point out what the changes would be.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the things that what I think about is, yes, we have this plan, and yes, we have these projections, but the reality of it is a lot of things are going to change.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not so much a set in stone, this is what's going to happen, as it is kind of like guide rails. Like,
Right.
if things are going well, and where we don't fall below a certain level in terms of the plan and the projections, we'll be fine. But once we fall through that level, if there needs to be an adjustment to spending for a year or two, or
Mm-hmm.
an adjustment to the amount that take for inflation. Those are conversations that we have, and that's why this is the beginning of the process, not the end of the process, because ultimately those things are going to happen. I don't know about you, but I have yet to write a financial plan that came to fruition 30 years down the road to the, anywhere close to the dollar amount.
Neither of us have been doing this long enough to claim 30 years, but
That's
yeah,
true.
I with the people that I've worked with over extended periods of time, we'll just put it that way, both for my own protection and theirs. Um, Extended periods of time. Yeah, it's usually like every 18 months to 24 months, we're changing goals, we're plugging things in we hadn't thought of, things that, and I think recognizing right up front, the human brain is horrible at setting long term goals. You know, so in a
Right.
way, it's kind of funny. We go through all this work because I think creating the vision and what's valuable to you helps with that process, but what those
Mm-hmm.
dollar goals and the timing of things, and we're not very good at that. And it's really there's lots of examples that you're just basically not good at knowing right now what the future you is going to want. Um, so we just kind of take it in stride and accept it as part of the planning process that 24 months from now, that plan to rent an RV and travel across the west the year after you retire is going to be replaced by you know uh, renting a place in New Mexico every other winter for the next 10 years. These things will evolve.
Right, which is why it's so important to, bring these out, every 4 to 6 months to take a look at the plan.
Hmm.
Obviously, we're updating all the financial stuff, but the other stuff needs to be updated as well, because those changes, we want to make sure that, we're in those guidelines with those changes that we're making. But it's so true, the best laid plans never seem to to have a hiccup in the road. So
Right,
all of those things are true in everything that you do, and that's why this is the starting point, not the place that we finish.
right, right.
So, another thing that we also will do as a part of this strategy meeting is start to look at some of the insurances, and just to make sure that if we have the plan in place, we have it the way that we want it, make sure we're protecting it from the standpoint
Hmm.
of protecting, against, life insurance. So an early death in the plan, or disability, or long-term care. Those are all things that we're going to
Hmm.
stress test the plan with and look at and help create a plan around each of those scenarios, so that we can continue the plan as the way it was intended should something like that come up, and if appropriate, purchase insurance for that. Not It's not like we're out here trying to push insurance for everything, but it's certainly, we do believe in having a plan for all of those scenarios.
Hmm.
Whether in whatever that plan is that's best for you, and that's part of moving the pieces around and walking through those, is to address those things, to make sure that we are aware of what the potential outcome is should one of those scenarios happen, and make a plan for it, not necessarily going out and buying a bunch of insurance.
Yep, yep. Um, and never fun to talk about insurance, but necessary part of the plan, and make sure those protections are in place. So from here, when we've had this in-depth conversation and strategy, then it's about putting those into actual recommendations that we've agreed upon. And that would be the next phase of implementing the plan.
Yeah, the build meeting. So going out of the strategy meeting, now we have a really good idea of the plan, and we have an idea of the trade-offs, and we kind of have some buy-in on the client end of what makes the most sense for them in terms of
Mhm.
what they're comfortable with and how the plan works out. So we can go into, again, the team will go back and start to build out the recommendations based on that plan, so that we can, and present that at the build meeting, which we will talk about in our next installment of this podcast next week.
There you go. I had a feeling that would be what we'd be talking about next Friday at this time.
So, if you have questions on any part of our planning process, feel free to reach out to info@srbadvisors.com. Love to answer those questions. Hopefully, you are enjoying our series on our process and how we walk clients through creating a financial plan. I know it's something that we're passionate about and love talking about. And so if you have questions on anything that we've discussed and how it relates to your plan, we would love for you to reach out.
Sounds good, Nick.
Dave,
Thank you, sir.
as always, enjoy your weekend. Thank you for the time, and I look forward to next week.
Yep. See you on the flip side.